Hello, everyone. Dr. Eames here. This time, I'd like to talk about some of the key indicators that we use to understand the U.S. economic system. As you can see here, there are two here. Uh, GDP, which most of us are familiar with that acronym. That's our gross domestic product. And really, what that is the total value of all the final goods and services at the end of a year produced in any given country. That would even include foreign country companies that are operating in our country. Um, they have to report that activity on taxes just like a domestic company would. And so those numbers also are entered into our GDP, even if they are foreign owned. Now, what we see is that when GDP changes, businesses do feel it. It affects whether or not you think it's smart time to invest or take advantage of opportunity or expand or whatever it is. Now, the other key economic indicator that we see listed here is the unemployment rate. And generally, when we look at labor, we generally go workers 16 years of age or older. So the unemployment rate is just a percentage of the total working population of those who happen to be unemployed and who have been looking for work at least for the prior month. And what this particular chart here shows us is the trend of the unemployment rate from 1989 all the way to 2017. And so you can see that it's gone down considerably over time, that in 2017, actually, it was slightly under 5%. Now, here's another graph that's showing how unemployment has changed dramatically in much more recent times. Here's from 1970 to 2020, and you can see that suddenly in 2020, we're at 3.28, as it says here, percent. How many million people have applied for unemployment insurance? Well, obviously, this is at the start of the pandemic back in March. Things have gotten considerably worse. If we look at the pandemic as the real cause of so many people being out of work right now, we have literally had about a million a week for over 10 straight weeks alone. This week was the first week in a while that we didn't top a million new unemployment claims being filed by individuals newly out of work. So literally 60 million people have lost their jobs since the beginning of the pandemic. Now, some of those, several millions, have gotten their jobs back as places have reopened, businesses resumed. But you really have to wonder how many have lost their jobs forever and so forth. Today, I believe that we are at about 13% of unemployment rate, which means quite a lot of those original 60 million who are unemployed are still unemployed. It's quite a large number still. And when we look at the GDP, what has happened to GDP since the onset of the pandemic and the collapse of a lot of economic activity, recent figures in the news indicate we've lost 29 point something percent of our GDP. That's absolutely incredible. Those are the levels that we had during the Great Depression of the early 1930s. So this is really almost unprecedented when we look at it. And these are indicators of how good are things, key indicators. Well, when we look at unemployment, there are four types. Here's a nice graphic that sort of sums up the information we see in our textbook about it. Right now, I would say we have what's called cyclical unemployment. If we look all the way to the one on the right, this is caused by a fall in aggregate demand. What is that? Aggregate means overall. So if a lot of businesses are failing, a lot of people are out of work, your demand has gone down. You have a lot less business going on, and therefore you have a decline in GDP. And we did 29% historic amount of loss. We've literally lost progress made in the country for 15 past years. And then, of course, declines in employment. We've had so many people out of work. So this pandemic is an example, a perfect example of what cyclical is. These things rise and fall. Sometimes they come unexpectedly, and they can repeat themselves. So things tend to be in a cycle. So that's what we're experiencing now. These other types that we see are more normal types of unemployment. Seasonal, of course. The good example here is workers who come over the border from Mexico. They work in our fruit fields in Arizona and Texas and in Southern California, and they pick strawberries and citrus fruit and all sorts of vegetables and things. Well, they're only needed at certain times of the year. We don't find that any Americans really want to do those jobs. So we really, someone who is unemployed because of seasonal reasons is not going to be surprised by those sorts of things. So it's really about what is the local demand for labor. Now we have structural unemployment. This comes when we have maybe your job skills have become obsolete due to technology or rises in automation that have just replaced your job with a robot. This is happening all over the country as we learn how to do new things, we innovate, we make technological advances, and people lose their jobs. And this does create a problem. People have to find that they have to develop new skills. The old skills aren't a match for the new jobs that are out there. And so the demand for certain types of labor has changed. That's structural unemployment. What we would hope is that you could develop some new industries. When the first ATMs came, it put a lot of bank tellers and cashier sort of jobs out of work. Well, it also created the ATM industry to make those machines and have skilled technicians go out and maintain them and do the maintenance on them and fix them when they don't work. The final type of unemployment here is frictional. This is simply people moving between jobs, means people have quit their job for whatever reason. Maybe they've been terminated. Maybe they've been laid off, transitional unemployment. So this is due to circumstances quite often out of our control. Now, here are some final key indicators that we want to look at to really tell us how an economy is doing. And so here's some real definitions for us. First, inflation. Inflation is easily defined. It's just when the price of everything seems to be going up over time. And this includes both tangible goods and services that we provide. It just seems like things are costing more. If they are costing more, then we have some inflation. How about disinflation? This is not exactly the opposite. This just means you still have inflation, but the rate of the increase of that inflation is slowing down a little bit. It's declining. The rate is declining, but you still have it. Now, deflation is the opposite of inflation. This is a situation where prices are actually declining instead of rising. So what's interesting is we can have inflation or deflation in a variety of industries all at the same time in any given economy. For instance, right now, would you say that the oil industry, the energy industry, is experiencing deflation or inflation in the prices? Well, think about the price of gas as we've seen it over the past year. We've generally seen a slow decline of prices in that industry. That's deflation. On the other hand, look at the cost of takeout food from restaurants since the pandemic, and groceries in general, the cost of those things. Are they higher or are they lower? Or are they the same as they've always been? I think we could make a good case that over the last 6 months, we've got inflation in food prices and so forth. So here are real world situations that illustrate these sort of key economic indexes that we can look at to tell us what is going on with the economy. And then we have this situation with stagflation. The economy is starting to slow down. Prices are going up anyhow. You could probably also make a pretty strong case right now that there is some stagflation going on because of the pandemic. Certainly the economy is slowing. If we've lost nearly 30% of our GDP, which was the entire quarter of the last quarter, we lost that much, a third of all the goods and services we put out are gone. That is serious. So I would say that indicates the economy is slowing, but a lot of our prices are going up, right, with food and so forth. Now we have a couple other what we call indexes here. The consumer price index is an important measure. It's called the CPI, and these are statistics that we get monthly. And it tells us the consumer price index is sort of a measure of how we have done regarding inflation and deflation. Are we changing? Are we moving from one to the other, and so forth? And what is that change? And we will look at CPI monthly and say, oh, okay, the economy's holding strong. Inflation is not increasing. It doesn't seem to be going down, but it's not really increasing. So we would use that index to give us an idea, again, of how do we predict what's going to happen in the future. And then we've, of course, got a way to look at inflation from different angles, of course. And so we can find out what is our core inflation rate by taking a couple things out of the mix that we're measuring. And certainly changes in food and energy, those were two examples I've just used. If we take those out of the mix and then still see what our inflation is, that tells us what is everything other than those two vital things we all have to have. What do we have inflation in all those other areas? And so core inflation does give us another slight different look, but another way to understand our economy. The final one I'd like to talk about here today is the PPI, which is the Producer Price Index. And this is a little bit different. It's an index that measures in general our prices changing at the wholesale level, not so much what we pay at the consumer level when we go into a store and buy retail goods or have a service done, but at the wholesale level. Are the distributors having to pay more for the products they're going to sell to us? And so that's a vital measure to know, because if that starts going up, just depending on the business, if they think it won't last long, they may not raise prices to consumers. But if it becomes a long-term trend, or they really think this is here to stay, we could see increases in other prices that hit consumers. So these things are obviously all interrelated, and they are the things that we want to take a look at and keep track of, particularly if we want to be successful in business. Okay, folks, that's all I want to talk about this time. I'll talk to you again soon.